And the subject matter of this video is a model that I always wanted to add to my collection, but never got the opportunity to build it. And now that I finally have one of these kits in my stash, it definitely makes my collection feel more complete. Hey everyone, this is John from mk.1, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale British Churchill Mark I infantry tank. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, I often mention in my build videos I frequently take on commission build projects, but those projects are between 1/35 and 1/6 scale. This model here being 1/72 is not in my usual working scales, so it's not something I generally take commission builds on. However, if anyone is interested on the scales that I do take commission builds on, I can be reached with the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and made some slight modifications and adjustments to the model to bring it up to the condition that we have here. In this video, I'm going to be giving this model a thorough in-box review, as well as I'm also going to be taking the viewer along and mentioning some areas of the kit to watch out for, highlighting some other really excellent areas of the kit, as well as some of the modifications that I mentioned previously. So stay tuned because there's going to be a bit of info coming right at you. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the British Churchill Mark I infantry tank. The Churchill tank was a British-designed infantry tank that was designed in the early portion of World War II by, of course, the British military. The vehicle entered into service shortly after its design period, and the vehicle served with the British Army all the way up from the North African campaign up until the end of the war. The vehicle itself was eventually retired by the British Army in 1952. When the vehicle was finally adopted, it was given the namesake Churchill after the one, the only Mr. Prime Minister himself, to which even he had some interesting quirks and quibs about the practice of naming the tank after him, one of which being the tank has more deficiencies than I do, as well as they decided to name it after me when they realized that the tank was no good. So, Winston did have a very interesting British sense of humor to him. However, he was actually giving the tank a bit more of a short stick than it really deserves, because the tank itself is actually one that is surprisingly really good and does have some really key benefits to it. Some of the hallmarks of the Churchill tank design is with its armor protection. This vehicle, when it was originally designed, had some of the best armor thicknesses compared to many of the other contemporaries that were in service at the time. Also, when it first entered into fielding, this vehicle was pretty much immune to the artillery pieces and the anti-tank ordnances that were used by the Germans at that time, aside, of course, from the infamous 88. Something else about this vehicle is that it's reported that this vehicle at the time had some excellent cross-country mobility. This vehicle can navigate through terrain that other vehicles at the time would have been bogged down in. So this again gave this vehicle quite a bit of an advantage. The vehicle had a very interesting design where it was carrying over some traits from the previous interwar vehicle designs, as well as also some designs that were going to be seen on other vehicles that were coming out as the war progressed. One of the iconic features found on the Churchill is with the way the tracks are designed. So the vehicle essentially is very similar to the design of the Char B1 bis, where we have no sponsons and we have a continuous track that just runs along the entire exterior portion of the vehicle. This is much along the lines as what we saw on the rhomboidal tank designs of World War I. However, unlike the earlier design vehicles where they basically had no suspension, the Churchill was going to utilize a spring suspension system and incorporated lots of tiny little bogie wheels in order to keep the track at its proper tension. It's because of this track design why this vehicle has the distinctive look to it that it does have. Later on, the top sections of the track had sheet metal tin work in order to conceal and cover it up for a multitude of reasons. However, on this particular version here, the Churchill Mark I, that is not present and the tracks are left completely exposed. With all of the armor, the vehicle weighed in at about 39 tons, and the vehicle was powered by a 12-cylinder Bedford gasoline engine. At its max, the vehicle could hit a top speed of about 15 miles an hour. Although that doesn't sound very impressive, but again, for the era, this is actually a vehicle that had some pretty decent mobility to it. For the vehicle's turret, the Churchill did have several iterations of turrets as the war progressed. Originally, the turrets were all cast, then later on as the war progressed, they would replace these with a standard slab steel and welded type assembly turret. The different turrets also changed with the different types of armament. As the war progressed, the armament on the Churchill kept on getting heavier and heavier, which necessitated the need for a redesigned turret to have more space in order for the crew to operate on the interior. Like I mentioned, as the war went on, there were several armament type changes and configurations for this powered vehicle. However, for the Churchill Mark I, in its original format, the vehicle would have had two main ordnances. The first was located in the turret, and it was a QF 2-pounder. In the hull, we had a larger 3-inch howitzer. This was again much along the lines as we saw on several other vehicles from the same era, namely again the Char B1 bis. As a coax, the original Churchill utilized a Besa MG chambered in 303. In total, 303 of the Mark I versions were produced until later iterations came and the production line switched to those other configurations. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this really cool vintage 1/72nd scale Churchill Mark I infantry tank kit from Hasegawa. This model here is a nice new addition to the stash. I picked it up off of eBay and the thing literally just came in, so there's going to be absolutely no dust sitting on the surface of this box here. This model here was actually the first model that is found on this channel from the model company of Hasegawa, and I'll be going over that momentarily. As for this kit, this is another one of these models I picked up off of eBay, and these models here are still relatively easy to find. I believe they might still be in production, but again, I'll circle back on that momentarily. As I mentioned before, this kit here is technically a vintage model kit. However, as far as I know, they are still in production from Hasegawa. As for the kit itself, well, this kit here was originally released by Hasegawa back in 1975. In the mid-1970s, this is when you had a lot of the Japanese model companies really starting to explore and expand on their kit listings. Some other examples would be Tamiya, where they expanded their 1/35th scale military miniatures line, as well as also their 1/48 and 1/25 military kit line. And you had other Japanese companies such as Fujimi doing the same thing in 1/76, Bandai doing it in 1/48 and 1/25, and also Hasegawa doing the same thing in 1/72. Over the years, Hasegawa would make a number of military vehicle kits in the 1/72nd scale range. As for the company itself, well again, Hasegawa is a Japanese model company and they have been in the game now for a number of decades. Hasegawa has been known to have some excellent quality model kits, and they are really some of the better kit options that are on the market. However, for the topic of this channel being military vehicle kits, you tend not to see me do many Hasegawa models because Hasegawa tends to make their kits generally 1/72, and 1/72 is not exactly a scale that I actively pursue. However, their kits have always been known for excellent quality. In the past, they were known for some of the best airplane model kits, like for instance, if you were a Phantom fan, Hasegawa kits were definitely going to be on your list. And they are also very well known in the ship model range, where they have an expansive line in the Japanese World War II model ship series from kits in both 1/700 scale and also 1/350. And I've seen lots of their 1/350 kits up close. They are fantastic in their overall quality and execution. In full disclosure, this is not the first time I've built a 1/72nd scale kit from Hasegawa. I actually built two other models from them back in my youth when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I've built an M4A3E8 Sherman, as well as also a early production Tiger 1. However, those are best left topics for another video for another day. So back to this particular kit over here. As I mentioned before, the kit was originally tooled up in the mid-1970s. However, these kits, along with the other kits in the Hasegawa range, have basically stayed in production since that point, and tracking them down is fairly easily done. The models have changed a little bit in the external appearance. I'll touch upon that momentarily. However, the cost of these models are still somewhat recently, or I should say relatively available. The cost on this one here is about $14 plus shipping, and that's generally the price range you'll see. You'll see them from the lower end in the teens to the higher end into the 30s and 40s, which in my opinion is a little bit much for something in 172, but then again, I'm not exactly an active 172 guy, so your results may vary. Having said that, I always had a special place for appreciating Hasegawa kits of any type. So as for the box art and graphic design, like I touched upon before, this kit has been released in many different guises since its original release in the mid-1970s. And they basically had the exact same type of box layout. The only difference is being some of the graphic design found here on the left-hand corner. The box design that we have here is the most current up-to-date one and has been in production, I believe, since 2009 or so. But the box itself actually dates back to the early 1990s. The original release of this kit had the exact same type of box art, and actually the box art stayed constant throughout all of the eras where this kit was released. It was just the verbiage here on the side changed with the color and some of the typography. The one you see here is basically the modern incarnation of the kit in its current skies. Utilizes this format for all of the kits that are released in a certain range, and in terms of their tank kits, they all have basically the exact same appearance, being it from an M1 to a Leopard to a Churchill, or basically anything that they produce that has tracks. So starting with the graphics, or I should say the box art, here we have the Churchill Mark I tank coming off of a landing craft, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe this may be Dieppe. The box art was one that I always found to be very interesting, and I always really dug this version of the Churchill. It's a very interesting one with the bow gun in it, much along the lines as you'd see on like an M3 Lee or so. The box art was one that I, again, personally appreciate because I used to see it everywhere when I was a kid, be it in modeling catalogs like Squadron Mail Order or Phoenix or something along those lines, as well as you would see them occasionally in hobby shops, stacked up with some of the other 172s from mostly Hasegawa. Back to the quality of the box art, it's actually very good. You can see the vehicle is very well rendered. I like the paint color choice found on the model, and also the tracks are nicely rendered as well. The remainder of the scene is also nicely illustrated out. It's an interesting scene where we have the landing craft in the background and another one of these vehicles coming off of the ramp, and then you have all the barrage balloons in the background. Still pretty cool, and again, it makes for a nice composition all in all. The remainder of the graphic design takes us right here where we have a gray sliver, and we have the Hasegawa logo right there on the bottom portion of the composition. Here we have the typeface used, and this is again used by Hasegawa on all of their military vehicle line. On the side section here, nothing really much going on, just the name of the vehicle. This is kit number MT27. Of course, it is 172, and we have some other information over here. One thing that's interesting about Hasegawa is that their kits are still made in Japan, and this is a bit different compared to the other Japanese companies like Tamiya, where all of their kits are produced in the Philippines. On this side of the box here, we have just some more text with a bunch of other verbiage right here. Basically just corporate info, if I'm not mistaken. On the side section, this is what the side tab looks like. We have the Hasegawa logo here in the black bar, and a bridge thumbnail of the exact same composition, with again the same type of verbiage that was mentioned previously. It's the same thing on the opposite side. Also, as I was mentioning before, this kit here was in this type of configuration since 2009. You have a copyright right over here. However, like I also touched upon before, Hasegawa originally went to this pattern of box in the 1990s, and I guess they just basically updated some of the verbiage on the side and added the URL as well as the modern information that I touched upon before. Opening up the box will reveal the kit contents, and all the components here are old school injection plastic molded. There are no, modern amenities like turned aluminum barrels or photo etch or anything like that. It's just straight up injection molded polystyrene, with the exception of the tracks, which are single piece vinyl, which means this is going to be a very enjoyable build. Everything is molded in this gray plastic, much along the lines like you would see on Dragon kits, or I should say some of the vintage Dragon pattern of kits. And this will allow us to open the bag up. The bag is hermetically sealed, which is quite customarily seen on these kits. And let me go ahead and pour out the contents. Okay, so I guess we should start with the bottom and work our way to the top. Mention all this later on. So here's the main runner here, which consists of the hull components. So the hull is a multi-piece assembly, and you can see the quality of the molds once the camera focuses in. We have some molded in tools on the back section, along with a little bit of flash, nothing much to, really mention, but you can see the shovel, the axe. We have some hatches over here. Note the grab handles are integrally molded in, which is something that, is customarily seen on kits of this vintage, but the pieces are very finely molded at that, and if I'm going to replace them or not, probably not actually. We'll see how that pans out as the build continues, but so far everything looks really, really good. Here you get to see the sprockets right over here. Sprockets appear to be a bit abridged with the amount of teeth that are found on the surface, but they're still more than capable of the job at hand. And here you can see the wheels, or I should say the remainder of the suspension. They are integrally molded into the side panel over here, which for a Churchill kind of makes sense because these parts are a bit fiddly if they were separate. But even though the parts are integrally molded on, let's see what the details look like up close. With the camera focused in, you get to see the quality of details, and even though this kit dates back to the mid-1970s, it definitely aged very, very well in my opinion. I like the front tensioner over here is a little, very finely molded bit of plastic. It's something you really got to pay attention to because something like that will easily snag and break. But again, mid-1970s tooling, and we have quality like that. That is just something you really wouldn't see on some of the other kits that are on the market from the same era. And again, it really goes to show the testament of the quality Hasegawa used while designing these model kits. On the opposite side, we can see some more sections of the sprue, or I should say of the components. You can see the sprocket hubs right there. And more of the hull sections. And again, this leads back to the tensioner section found on the front idler. Or would it be a front sprocket? I don't know. It's an idler with teeth. So it's a sprocket. Debate in the comment section. On the lower section over here, we can see the lower hull pan. It looks like at some point, if I'm not mistaken, it appears that there may have been some corporate information over here for the Hasegawa logo, but I guess they decided to change that for one reason or another, and they just added this plate right here on the bottom section. On the reverse side, I'm pretty sure I'm going to see the Hasegawa logo, and yep, there it is right over there. Like I stated before, these kits are still made in Japan. The next sprue takes us to some more lower suspension pieces, and lower hull fittings for that matter. We have here what appears to be the rear fuel tank, as well as some more suspension bits. The wheels are the same quality as ones found on the other sprue. And the spring setups over here also have their spring coil detailings integrally molded on, which again is a very nice bit of detailing considering the size of this model. The final plastic runner takes us to the turret, and again, the model does not disappoint. It has all of the intricate geometry found on the very early pattern of the Churchill, and it's probably one of my favorite aspects of this vehicle just because of the unique shape that the turret does have, along with the tank missing its tin work, which I'll go more about that as the video progresses. But regardless, you could see again the quality levels that we have here on a kit that's this small and also of this vintage. And it really goes to show if you execute something very, very well, the kit can be very future-proof indeed. Here we have the exhaust manifolds. Again, just very, very high-quality pieces. The final sprue takes us to the tracks, and they are single-piece vinyl, as God intended, and they are very nicely done with the rendering. They do have the look and feel of the very early pattern of Churchill tracks for this kit here, obviously more than appropriate. The material itself is very, very flexible, which is excellent, which means it'll contour very well with the shape of the vehicle in question. The inner portion over here does have some slight detailing molded in, but nothing nearly as detailed as we expect to see on more contemporary kits on the market. However, for this model here, this is more than suffice for the job at hand. The next thing we have here is the decal sheet. It appears to be good quality with the overall printing. It's a blue paper backing, and the decals appear to be excellent quality, you know, much along the lines of what you would expect to see on most current kits that are on the market today. I'm pretty sure, just like with Tamiya and some of the other companies, Hasegawa, when they keep these older kits in production, they just update the decal sheet, just giving it printings that are done with more modern machines and technology, and that appears to be the case here. The decals look to be very nicely printed on, and we'll see how they apply and secure to the vehicle with the matte varnish as the video progresses. The very last thing we have are the instructions, and this is just so Hasegawa with the layout. Here we also have a nice little just tips and tricks type little pamphlet, quite customarily seen in a lot of these Japanese kits, and one of the things that some of the charm that Japanese kits do have is little things like this that just make them cool. But here we have the little instruction pamphlet, and yes, it is in a little pamphlet form, which is pretty cool too. And you know what you see here, they appear to be hand-drawn type drafting drawings, which would be, you know, typical for the era that this kit was designed in. And these are much along the same lines as, you know, the older Tamiya instructions that I've reviewed many times in the past. Seems like a fairly simplistic build, and, you know, if there are any mistakes with the instructions, I'll gladly go ahead and mention them as the video goes on. Here we have some marking options. As we saw before, decals sheet does have several variants available, and it's going to be interesting to see which one I actually go with. And here's the model, now ready for painting. And I gotta say, this thing was a ridiculously, blisteringly fast build. It went together in hardly no time, which is a testament to the engineering work that went into this kit done by the engineers at Hasegawa. So bravo to you guys. The model is, again, it's a very excellent build, but there are a few things I do want to mention. First, with the way the suspension is designed, it is a multi-part assembly where you have three components that get sandwiched together to form the complex suspension that we have here. And it's done in a very nice manner in that it's basically everything's in large sub-assemblies, so there are no fine little fiddly bits to work with like these tiny little road wheels here. The one thing I do want to mention though is that you want to assemble them in halves first. So on each of these pontoons over here, the best way to put it, you first install the inner spring sections to the one side, let it dry, then you go ahead and install the back end, clamp everything together, let it dry. And then once that's all set, of course, then you can mount it to the hull. Sadly, I didn't get any photographs of the pontoons in assembly. However, what I used to clamp them together, and by the way, these things are fantastic for just about any modeling subject, let alone working on something this small, but I utilize these on my 135s, my 16s, and even my 116s, are these small little spring clamps here. I got these from Tractor Supply in the dollar bin aisle, and these things have been absolutely awesome. And basically, when I had everything gluing together, I had just a row of them like this on the wheels and also on the reverse ends. This was a fantastic way to ensure that everything was properly aligned. With the way the wheels are designed, you have these half-moon cutouts found on certain, like every other wheel, and these are an indexing point, and the things just lock into them. You have to be careful though, because it's not foolproof. You can have a slight shift here or there, and the piece can still be glued on in place, so the builder does have to pay attention to that during construction. Same thing is also true, by the way, for the sprockets, which are not on the table at this time, but basically you have like a half-moon cutout on each of the wheels, and they plug in together. It works very well, but it's not foolproof, and there can be some shift going on, so you have to be very careful when the assembly is going on, and you have to be careful that the glue's set properly. So that is really the biggest caution you need to be aware of. On the remaining of the assembly at this time, you'll see that the sprockets are currently not fitted to this model, and this is done just so I can thoroughly paint everything, because with a vehicle like this, trying to get paint in here with the sprockets in place is going to be very, very, very difficult, and chances are really good you're going to have missed paint areas. So in order to prevent that, the sprockets are off. I went ahead and tested this out before the thing was glued together, but you can actually slip the sprockets into the front section and rear section here, because the plastic is fairly thin and is somewhat flexible. Now, this is something that you have to be very, very, very cautious about. You don't want to go in here with rough hands, because if these things snap on you, now your life has just been made infinitely more difficult. But for me, I was able to test this theory out. I was able to install and remove the sprockets a number of times just before the thing was, ready to slide off into final assembly. But again, if you are going to go with this method, be very, very, very careful, because these things are very thin, and if they break, you're going to be pretty much, let's just say your life's going to be a bit more difficult. That's all for the hull at this time. There's more stuff I'm going to be mentioning, but that's after the model's fully painted. And this brings us to the turret. The last thing I want to mention on the turret is with the bins. These storage bins that we have here are hollow on the underside. And in order to improve the model a bit, I just took some very thin plastic strip, glued it onto the bottom of the bins, and then just sanded away the remnants, leaving for the shape that we have here. With this now sealed off, it makes the model, in my opinion, just a little bit better in that regard. Also, this is not going to be seen at this time, but cast texturing has been added to the turret. This is just done with thick super glue, and I use a stapling technique that I use my finger for in the same manner that I use on many of my other builds, only the medium on those are red putty. I do have a tutorial about how to apply this and can be found in the video description below. Only I'm using red putty in that technique, and here you can see, well, not yet, but on this one here, I utilize the same exact technique just with the super glue and yields for some, very similar results. Other than that, the two turret halves go together very, very well, and the barrel is functional. Again, I'll be circling back on that as the video goes on. Starting with the model's running gear, as I touched upon before, there needs to be some care exhibited by the builder in order to get everything properly glued together and installed in the appropriate manner. And once everything's fully painted and weathered, you can really see just how nicely executed the kit really is. The wheels have some really nice detailing on them, and this all comes out into better focus with the Tamiya dark Panaline accent, which is something I'll touch upon a little bit later in the paint and the weathering aspect of the video. But regardless, here you get to see what it looks like in its final form. Everything that you see here is 100% stock out of the box, with absolutely zero modifications that have been made to this area in any way, shape, or form. Also, as I mentioned before, these sprockets are something that I was able to paint separately off the model and then mount towards the tail end. And as you can see, they dropped into their appropriate location without any sort of extra problems. You do want to exhibit care on the piece, though, if you're going through this type of procedure, as, the plastic is fairly flexible, but it does have its limits. If you have a heavy hand, this is something that perhaps is something you want to pay attention to, because, again, if these things snap, it's going to lead to much more problems. On the sprocket itself, as I mentioned before, on the teeth that are found on the molding, they were a bit on the sparser side. However, once everything is fully assembled, they kind of just blend in with the remainder of the model's detailing, and it's something that isn't really noteworthy. On the rear sprocket over here, again, similar type effect, just snaps into its location, and you're good to go. One thing that I did miss before when the model was in its pre-painted format was on the rear section. There are two seams found in these two sections here on the side of the hull, and these are best taken care of prior to the side pontoons getting fitted in place, because once those get installed, obviously you're not exactly going to get access into these locations here to polish them down. The seam work was very, very minor, just a little bit of super glue and some sandpaper, and boom, you're basically taken care of when it comes time for a seam removal procedure. So this was something that was really easily done. It's one of those things where if you don't take care of it at an earlier stage, somehow, some way, it will come around and bite you towards the tail end of the model once everything is fully painted and weathered. So be sure to take care of that at that time there, and the model will be built in a much more streamlined manner. And while on the running gear, this takes us to the track. The track is the kit original single-piece vinyl track, and it is excellent. The track is painted and weathered in my usual format, which means you do not want to use enamels or spray paints. This is done with Tamiya acrylic paint, the XF black, or XF1, which is flat black. That's applied to the track surfaces with the airbrush, and then the model is airbrushed with some watered down flat white in order to get a faded type Parkerized look, and then it is dry brushed with the silver paint over here to give you the distressed track or distressed surface look, which these powered tracks would definitely have, specifically if the vehicle's driven on a hard surface for not a whole lot of distance. The tracks go together very easily. The tracks do not have really deep like pegs that need to line and index into each other. These are the type of things that you'll see on some 1/35 scale kits. So you want to take your care when gluing them together, and this is just glued together with a little drop of super glue. With a razor knife, I scrape off the paint that's found on the areas where the two sections need to conjoin. A drop of super glue, you let the thing thoroughly dry, and then once it's set, the tracks are fitted in place. The reason why I have to mention you want that the glue to be thoroughly dry is because the tension on this kit here is actually pretty stiff, which is something that you want because it gives you the nice iconic look that you have here. But if you are just going through the motions or are rushing, the tension is going to have a tendency to pop the joints on the tracks, and this is something that you don't want to happen to you because it's just going to lead to some problems. So glue the tracks together, let the stuff fully dry, and then that'll give you a really best case scenario on getting the tracks fitted in place. Once they slide into place, the installation is thoroughly completed. Once the track is fitted in place, it times very well with the sprockets, and because this is a dual sprocket build, you are going to have to fiddle a little bit just so that the teeth index into the appropriate holes found on the track. Fortunately, this is something that's fairly easily done, and when you're done, the track can actually rotate on this model here. It is tight enough where it has some good tension, but it is flexible enough where it can rotate. However, I don't recommend doing that. This is not something that you want to play with. Although it can be done, with the way the tracks are, the paint will just brittle off on them in a really short period of time. So this is something that is best left just, you set it and you forget it type thing. There are some people out there that buy models to actually play with them. And if that's the case, yeah, you can theoretically play with this one, but I think that the tracks will probably snap on you, causing some extra problems, and it's just not really that durable of a playable model. If you're looking for a model to play with, get something in the World War II's lineup, or even one of the other vintage kits that I touch upon on this channel. This one here, it's basically just a static model through and through, and you should be treated as such. From the track takes to the rear fuel can, and again, what you see is what you get. This is a two-piece assembly, so some seam work is needed to be exhibited by the builder. Again, just like with the hull, just some thick super glue, a needle file, and some sandpaper were all that was required to get the unit polished down to the format that we have here. Fortunately, with the way the kit is designed, the halves line up very well, so the amount of body work required is going to be very minimum. Hopping to the front of the model brings us to probably one of the more unique and interesting aspects on this pattern of the Churchill, and that is the bow cannon. The kit's detailing is very simple, but it's also very detailed at the same time. This kit really does a good job at bridging ease of construction and high detail fidelity. So one other thing to mention about this section, that the kit gives you two options. You can build it in this format here with the bow cannon, or you can build it as the version that came a little bit later on, where instead of the ordnance that we have here, it has an MG. So for this kit, you do have two options that are available. Obviously, for this one, I was going to roll with the bow cannon, and that's the version that we have here. Everything you see here is built stock out of the box, and no bodywork was required in order to get the model built up to the condition that we have here. So it does go together, again, very nicely. The one area on this build that I did add a little bit of extra improvements was with the muzzle section here of the bow cannon. On the kit, the unit is just molded as a solid piece of plastic, which is quite customarily seen on many tank kits that are out there. And in my typical format, with a very small Dremel bit, a pin vise, and a very steady hand, I was able to drill this material out to the format that we have here. This is something that, again, it's a very risky procedure, but in my opinion, it's one that really does help polish the model further. But I gotta hazard this. This is only a technique that should be done by someone that has the tooling, the steady hand, and the experience. If you do not have either of those things, this is not the technique for you. This is one sure way you can screw up the build by messing up this section over here, and it is not very forgiving. There's not a whole lot of plastic over here. It's better to just leave this solid and just paint the model accordingly, as opposed to trying something like this, screwing it up, and then, you're kind of playing catch up and having to do some extra repairs that you really didn't have to do before. So this is, again, only something that should be left for someone that has the experience and the technique for. But if you do have those prerequisites, I cannot recommend doing this procedure enough. As you can see, it really does help the look of the model immensely. The very last thing I want to mention on the bow area are the headlights. These are the two smallest bits of details on the entire kit, and care must be exhibited by the builder during the build in order to remove them off the sprue, remove the burrs off of them, get them fitted in place, and continue to build without losing one. The fact that I was able to go through all of that and still have the units fitted in place is nothing short of a sheer miracle. These are the type of parts that beckon to be flung off to Lost Partia, so when you're working on one of these models, you definitely want to be on the ball and pay attention to these two locations right here. Fortunately though, the pieces went on very well. Again, they are very nicely engineered, as is the rest of the kit. This is going to be a common reoccurring theme on this video if you haven't noticed already. And the detailing on them is exquisite. You just have to take your patience when you're going through the actual assembly process. But if you do, the parts are definitely nicely done in that regard. Hopping back to the rear portion of the model takes us to some of the integrally molded on fittings, and these are things that the builder needs to, again, be on the ball with in terms of properly painting them, because this is one way you can tell a beginner from someone who has some experience. So the first thing I want to mention is with the track. There are two spare track links found on either side here of the side of the hull. These are integrally molded on, and the detailing on them is very nicely rendered. But you have to carefully paint them with the paintbrush and weather them accordingly in order for you to get the look that we have here. One thing about the tracks is that there is a segment that's found right over here, and this is actually part of the tank, and this is something you want to pay attention to when painting the spare track link. And this is also applicable for the tools that are found on the rear deck. We have here an axe and a shovel. Both of these are integrally molded on, and as you can see, I had to carefully paint them accordingly. When you're painting components like these three fittings, this is where paint thickness is going to be an absolute must. You have to have just the right consistency, otherwise you're going to have problems on either end. If it's too thick, it's going to be too chunky, and if it's too thin, it's just going to run all over the place like a wash. Neither of which are something that you want to have happen to you on a build like this. Also, in addition to the paint thickness, the other thing that's going to be paramount is the consistency and the quality of the brush. This is another one of those applications where the brush needs to be at just the right type of bristle. You want to have a nice fine point paintbrush, and it needs to be in excellent shape. If you're using an older brush that you have on hand, and the bristles are starting to fray on the edges and it's just not that crisp anymore, obviously this is not something you want for a precision painting like the ones you see here. If you are going to paint these components, you definitely want to be on the ball in both of those areas. And fortunately though, with the way the pieces are molded, they are molded in a way where they are quite pronounced, which is great because when you're painting them, this really will help guide the paintbrush during the paint application process. Carrying on, takes to the exhaust manifold. These were something that I touched upon earlier in the video, and as you can see, they paint very, very nicely and look very good once fitted in place. I like the way they have their heat shields integrally molded on, and they are perforated, which is a nice little bit of detailing, even for this scale. And also, the one modification I made to them was with, again, the very fine Dremel bit and a pin vise, and I was able to drill out the exhaust manifold sections. Hopefully it comes out on camera, and you can see exactly how much added detailing and how much more polished the model looks with these sections drilled out. But again, needless to say, this is something that you want to really have the experience for. Otherwise, just leave it as is. There's nothing wrong with leaving the stock one, specifically if you don't have the tooling or the skill at hand. And this leads us to the next really interesting and probably the cooler aspect on this particular vehicle, and that is the turret. Like I mentioned before, the Churchill Mark I version of the turret, it has a very interesting shape to it, and the Hasegawa kit is equally as excellently as rendered. So you can see, hopefully, the cast texturing now coming out into view that I touched upon before with the use of the super glue. It's just a really easy way to add a little bit extra detailing to this model. The cast texturing was applied to all of the surrounding surfaces, leaving for the result that we have here. Some of the fittings I do want to mention are pretty vague in the instructions. They don't exactly tell you where they go. They just kind of have like a rough arrow pointing to this section, and there are no corresponding indication points found on the kit itself. And this is specifically true for this little periscope that we have here. So much so that when I was going through this build, I actually went on the internet and I was fortunate enough to find an example of a real Churchill Mark I in this exact same configuration that's preserved. And there was a nice clear photograph of this section of the vehicle, which allowed me to align the components where they need to go. And the way you see my model over here is exactly lifted from that real example that I was just referencing. So this is something you definitely want to keep in mind if you're building one of these kits. On the top portion of the detailing, again, the kit is so nicely designed. The hatches are separate moldings. They just drop directly into place. If you are going to make this with the hatches open, this is an option that can be done. The kit does give you a figure, but like I always mention in my videos, my models, I always just render them buttoned up, so the figure is just going to languish away in my figure bin. And as a customary thing I mentioned, if anyone is interested in any scale figures from 172 all the way up to 132, hit me up. I have a bunch of them sitting in a bin not doing anything, and if you need some, you know, that's something that could definitely be arranged. With that quick plug out of the way, this takes to the remainder of the detailing. We have here some turret periscopes, and they are rendered in the open position, and with a very careful fine paintbrush, I added some gloss black to all these locations, which is true for not just the turret, but also for the hull. You can see them right there on the bow hatches. And also we have one right here on the driver's visor. Actually, no, that's not the driver. This is a British vehicle. I believe that is actually the gunner's optic, and this is the visor right here for the driver, if I'm not mistaken. Hopping back up to the turret takes to the secondary ordnance, where we have the coax MG as well as the smaller caliber cannon. And the unit is fully functional in that it goes up and down. This is something that is decently engineered inside the kit, but when you're assembling, you want to be careful because of the way the two turret halves go together. The piece can potentially fall out during the assembly, and also when you're going through the seam removal process, you want to make sure you don't have an extra drop of glue landed on the inside over here, which can gum up the works. As for the pivoting itself, it's actually pretty stiff, which is great. On a lot of models, you tend to need a little drop of white glue on the pivoting section just to stiffen up to prevent droop, but on this one here, that's just not the case, and what you see is basically what you get. Also, when you're going through the motions, you want to be careful not to glue several of these components in place until the bodywork is completed, for a reason that should be fairly obvious. And the last thing I want to mention is that on the ordnance over here, you can see I went ahead and drilled this section out as well, in according, as I mentioned before, on the bow cannon and also on the exhaust manifolds. And just like on those areas here, you can really see just how much more improved the model looks with all these little, fine little detail fittings and alterations added in place. But you don't want to forget the coax, which is right over here, and this is something that is not drilled out. It is far too tiny for that, but the unit was still painted in the condition that we have here. Again, just the little things is what makes the build fully flesh out. The very last thing I do want to mention about the turret is with the storage bins. As I mentioned before, the bins on this model are open with the stock configuration. This was something that I plated over with some sections of thin sheet styrene. And this was something that you don't have to do, but it's one that I personally feel makes the build much better if taken care of. Even though you really don't see these sections underneath, I just don't like the idea of having these bins with the bottom sections being completely open and hollow. So once they are plated over, you can see exactly how much more improved the model again is with the addition of these two small, slight little modifications. And of course, there was one very last thing I forgot to mention, and it would have been malpractice if I didn't, and that would have been the antenna base. On this kit here, there is a British pattern of antenna base that's molded into this section over here, and the British antenna bases are a conical rubber unit, and there would be the provisions for mounting the actual antenna wire on the center of it. Well, on the model over here, the conical section is molded in. However, you'll see that it's so finely molded that trying to drill it out, even with a pin vise with the smallest bits that I have, in order to fit the wire in place, is just going to be problematic. So I just simply omitted from the model. Just because the antenna isn't fitted, that doesn't necessarily mean the model is inaccurate, because again, these antennas, can be plugged on or removed at a moment's notice, and because of that, you can have the antenna base in place without the wire fitted, and that's how I went with this model over here. So in order to do that, the cone itself is just painted with the rubber black color in order to make it stand out from the remainder of the model, and again, give it for the added extra accuracy. Since the piece is molded in, the only thing you gotta do is just properly paint it, and then you're basically good to go. And that's all there is to mention about the detailing and the build aspect of this model, and this takes us now to the paint work. Before the model even head off into paint, of course, it was thoroughly primed with a coat of El Cheapo flat black spray paint. not the tracks, of course, just the plastic sections. And after that, it then received its base coat. All of the paintwork on this model here is done with Tamiya acrylics, and it was done with the airbrush. So the base coat was either Tamiya olive green or Tamiya black green. It was either one or the other. It's honestly been a little while since I built this model, but since I do have a few other British tanks in the lineup, I really need to figure out what the actual color was, but I'm pretty sure I'll figure it out when I actually do a little bit more thinking on the subject. Regardless, this was done with the airbrush, and for the remainder of the weathering work, this was done all again with the airbrush as well. This would include the filtering, the sun fading effects, as also the counter shading effects. The airbrush did the lion's share of the weathering work that you see here, and then the next leg of the weathering was done with the paintbrush, and this would be the use of Tamiya Panaline Accent. And this is something that for this build here is greatly appreciated. The Panaline Accent does a fantastic job going to all these little nooks and crannies and just making them pop out in a way that just really makes the model just stand out. This is true for the road wheels that I touched upon before, the springs, as well as also all of the little hatches that are found on the top section. This vehicle is just clustered with them. In addition to the Panaline Accent, I then added the paint chipping effects with my usual technique with the use of a dry brush with some flat black, and that gives you the looks that we have here. As for the markings, the ones on this model here are the kit supplied water slide decals, and they were great. They went out without any sort of problems. They were excellent qualities, which, you know, it's kind of customary what you see on these Japanese kits. The kit does give you enough options for 2 versions of the Churchill Mark I, and the markings I went with this one was the one that was on the Boxer, and I just wanted to emulate that one as close as possible. The other thing to mention about the markings is with this one that we have right here on the front, you'll notice that the ID number is in an angle, and it's quite severely tilted, and this is not a mistake. This is as per the instructions. They had that quite clearly labeled, and so I went ahead and added the marking accordingly. Generally, when you're building a model like this, they tend to be in a straight line, and even my inner OCD was really trying to force me to do that, but, you know, I wanted to follow the instructions as close as possible, so I went ahead and actually did the marking accordingly. As for the remainder, after the markings were added, the entire model was coated in VMS matte varnish, leaving for the results that we have here, and as I often mention in these videos, I really like this product, and it makes for some very excellent results once added in place. The varnish is also, by the way, applied via the airbrush, and I just spray it on much along the lines you see on that tutorial on the exact same product that's found on YouTube. And I do recommend checking out if you're in the market looking for a varnish for your models. And I am a huge fan of varnishing, and it definitely does make the model look 10 times better. And in the end, I am ecstatic, and I couldn't be any happier in how this build turned out. This was a model that is definitely a very old burning itch that has finally been scratched. As I touched upon in the pre-video intro, this was a kit that has been on my radar and on my wish list now for the last 30 plus years. So finally getting to it, building it to this condition and having it in the collection, words just pale in comparison onto just how rewarding and just how satisfying that feeling really is. And even though it took me as long as I did to get to this model, it is definitely something I do not regret. This model here is a gem. It is an excellent kit, and it's also a testament to show you that even though a kit is old, that doesn't mean it is something that needs to be retired. This kit here, it truly is a hallmark of getting something right. When this kit was designed all of those decades ago, they did such a good job on it that the model is basically future-proof. And almost 50, close to 60 years later, this thing here is not only still a relevant kit, but it can still keep up with the modern super kits of this era, which is a true testament to the engineers who were working at Hasegawa back during that era. This kit really does check lots of boxes. Not only is the detail fidelity excellent, but the ease of construction and just the overall engineering of the kit on how the parts go together is also, again, on par with many modern kits. This is not going to be the type of kit where, you're going to have to do some hand fitting here or there to make sure the pieces line up and all of that type of stuff, which is generally seen on many older designed kits. This one, it's pretty much solid from the get-go. Again, 2 thumbs up to whoever designed this kit from Hasegawa. And I suppose this slides us into skill level and recommendation. And if you are a beginner, I do not necessarily recommend this kit for you. This, even though the kit assembles very, very well and it is nicely engineered, because of several of the small fittings that are found on this model, this is really not intended for someone that's straight off the boat, so to speak. So if you never touched a plastic model kit in your life, this is not going to be the kit for you. The looks are a bit deceiving because it does look like a simple build, and for the most part, it really is. It just has some areas where a beginner just doesn't have the skills fully fleshed out yet. This is not the type of kit for someone who's never touched a model kit before. This is the type of kit for someone that's built about half a dozen or so, maybe 8 or 9, and at that point there, you should have some of your fundamentals ironed out, and you can be able to, at that point, throw one of these kits together and do so in a fairly good measure. Does that make you an intermediate? Yes or no? Me, it's more of like an advanced beginner, I guess best way to put it. But outside of the beginner, a intermediate builder and an advanced builder can definitely tackle one of these models over here. And they are an excellent choice. And again, I definitely recommend it for either of those individuals. Even though the kit is somewhat simplistic, the detail fidelity on it is excellent, and these models can keep up with many of the modern tooling 172s that have been released in recent years. I'm not really sure if there are any aftermarket components for this particular kit that are on the market. Basically, what you see is what you get, so this is something where you can just build it with the out-of-the-box components and call it a day, and it'll be perfectly adequate in your collection in that format. And I'd say we've officially crossed the borders into recommendation. And right out there, if you are a fan of World War II armor or just British armor in general, this kit here is a solid recommend. If you're a fan of Braille scale armor and you have a collection of smaller scale builds, this kit again is also one that should definitely be on your wish list. Another definite recommend would be anyone who's into early era World War II armor. So if you have the Panzer I, the Panzer II, the early version of the Panzer IV, or even several of the other British tanks from the same era, this kit here is a huge, huge recommendation for you, and it will be a fantastic asset to have in your collection. Another definite collector is anyone who's an avid Churchill fan. When it comes to the Churchill, there are a ton of different options that are available in different scales, and if that's you, this kit here is another kit that should be on your radar. In fact, do not walk, run to the nearest option that you can find in order to acquire one of these because they are just exquisite. Another person who is not necessarily a recommend for this kit would be anyone who's into making dioramas, and specifically the Dieppe Raid. This version of the Churchill was used in the Dieppe Raid. However, the reason why I don't necessarily recommend this particular kit is because Hasegawa themselves actually produced a dedicated release of this model for the Dieppe Raid. The reason why this is noteworthy is that the Dieppe Raid vehicles had some extra fittings on them that are not present with this tooling, but they are present on the other kit in question, and I believe it gives you the Churchill and another vehicle if I'm not mistaken. If you're looking for something that's dedicated for Dieppe, that would be the kit that I would recommend all day long for that application. Outside of that, it's a tank model. Basically, any tank model is great for a diorama setting in one flavor or another. The last person I'd recommend this kit to would be anyone who's an avid fan of building and collecting vintage model kits. This kit here is a vintage kit. Even though it is a currently produced and a continuously produced kit, it's still a vintage kit nonetheless, as the tooling does go back to the mid-1970s. However, this is a great asset because unlike many of the other vintage kits that I touch upon on this channel, where a lot of times they've crossed over into collector status, which means the prices tend to go up on them, these models here are still fairly commonly found, and because of that, the prices are very low. With those factors in mind, you could acquire one or a couple to your collection, and this is something that would be a great asset. On a similar lines, because of the price and availability, I would also recommend this kit to wargamers. Braille scale 172 is a wargaming scale, and these kits here would be a fantastic choice. With the availability and the cost, you acquire a number of them, build out your units, and it's definitely something that would hold up pretty decently in a wargaming type setting. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/72nd scale Churchill Mark I infantry tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.